Forests, Jim, don't just happen. It takes management, it takes a lot of work. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, the key difference between an urban forest and a natural forest is millions of people wander through this forest every year.
That also brings in the challenge of invasive species, and there are some plants growing in here, obviously, that aren't native to Stanley Park. How do you manage that, and can you give us some examples?
The first is English ivy, which many people have seen growing up the trunks of various trees in the park. The ivy, over time, will actually kill the host tree that it's growing on. And the other is Himalayan blackberry. It's a typical thorn bush, a berry bush, not unlike a raspberry, but it's much more aggressive and fast growing.
Now, this is a young plant, but it doesn't take long to take over, does it?
That's correct. They tend to outperform the indigenous species that traditionally made up the forest floor.
So that impacts the understory, a lot of the plants on the ground. Talk a little bit more about the canopy and the trees and the challenge of preserving that in its natural state.
About 150 years ago, the loggers of the day high-graded out most of the good cedar and the good Douglas fir, leaving the hemlock behind. A hemlock of 100 years old is already in decline, whereas when we talk about great cedars and firs, they are hundreds of years old. If you remember from the storm, there were a lot of shattered trunks that seemed to break off at about 20 and 30 feet up.
Yeah, they snapped right in the middle, which seemed very strange to anybody who came through the park.
If you look closely, every one of those cases was hemlock.
So how do you manage it?
We look for diseased trees, and at a certain point we say, this is no longer safe, and we actually have to remove them.
So Jim, it's really about getting the forest back to the state it was in before there was human intervention here.
What we have to do is to try and reconstruct that balance of 150 years ago with about 1/3 of each dominant type of conifer in the park. So come on along and we'll show you what we're up to. All right, we're heading into a much darker part of the forest than we were in previously, Chris, and this is part of the problem in itself. What's around us was planting that occurred after the major blowdown with the Frida storm in the mid-60s. You'll notice there's almost no growth on the forest floor whatsoever, and when we look up the tree, you'll notice that 2/3 of the branches are dead, that it's only the top bit that has any needles left.
So basically, you need to thin parts of the forest out by taking out the sick and unhealthy trees and giving a little bit more light and a chance for that understory and healthy trees to grow.
Yeah, this type of planting, which was more of an industrial mentality at the time, was premised on coming back at some point and thinning. Now, this will never be a robust forest as it should, and so now we should take some remedial action.
So the park board knows that as part of its forest management plan, occasionally you're going to need to do some chainsawing and removing some of these trees. That's a good thing, not a bad thing.
It is a good thing, and the most important thing is it will not recover from this condition if we just continue to leave it.
All right, nature needs a helping hand, so maybe we better let him get to work.
All right.
Jim, this is a pretty good example of a blowdown area that came about after the storm. Tell us what you've done in here.
We've had people in here actually brushing back some of the forest floor to give the new plantings an opportunity.
And I guess replanting was a big part of what you had to do in the blowdown areas like this.
Yeah, we planted over 15,000 new trees after the storm. Here's an example of a little cedar we put in. These are almost feather-like needle compared to the sharp, rounder needles that you find on the fir and the hemlock. We put in about half cedars and half firs.
So this really is a key building block for the forest of the future.
Oh, definitely. Hopefully someday we will see a forest that is truly typical of what would have been here in, say, 1800.
And it takes a well thought out forest management plan to do that, and obviously a big help has been all of the money donated to the Stanley Park Fund after the 2006 windstorms as well. Wouldn't be possible without that?
No, it wouldn't have, and in fact the forest would have continued its decline had we not had this opportunity to change direction and bring the park back to what it was originally.
Sounds like the future looks pretty good here
I think so.
in Stanley Park's urban forest. Thanks for teaching me a little bit more about it, Jim.
Glad to do it.